Yuma. Here we are back in the shed again, kicked out of the house to do today's audio for The Silver Sword, Chapter 13, The Frozen Journey. It's quite a long chapter today, so let's just crank into it. Chapter 13, The Frozen Journey. There was still something left at the railway station at Posen. The track had been mended, of course. There was no such thing as timetable, but some trains, though much delayed, were getting through to Berlin, 250 miles to the west. In one of those trains, Ruth, Edith, Jan and Bronia were travelling. It was crowded with refugees. They leaned from the windows, stood on the footboards, lay on the carriage roofs. Ruth's family was in one of the open trucks, which was cold but not so crowded. "I don't like this truck," said Bronia. "It jolts too much." "Every jolt takes us nearer to Switzerland," said Ruth. "Think of it like that, and it's not so bad." "There's no room to stretch." "Rest your head against me and try to go to sleep. There, that's better." "It's a better truck than the other one," said Jan. "It's got a stove in it. We can scrape the coal dust off the floor. That's why I chose it. When it gets dark, they'll light a fire and we shall keep warm." "The stove's right in the far corner. We shan't feel it from here," said Bronia. "Stop grumbling, Bronia," said Ruth. "We're lucky to be here at all. Hundreds of people were left behind at Posen. They may have to wait for weeks." "Edith was lucky to come at all," said Jan. "The doctor wanted to send him back to the Roth camp, didn't he?" "He said you wanted fattening up, as if you were a goose being fattened for Christmas," laughed Bronia. "The doctor wouldn't let him come at all. If I hadn't argued with him," said Jan. "They wanted to keep us all, didn't they, Ruth?" said Bronia. "It was because they wanted to look after us," said Ruth, and she thought with satisfaction how they had stuck to their point and persuaded the authorities to let them go. She smiled as she remembered the conversation she had overheard afterwards between the doctor and Mrs. Borowitz, the welfare officer. "Those children insist on going to Switzerland. It's their promised land, and we've got no power to detain them," Mrs. Borowitz had said. And when the doctor had remarked that Edith was too ill and would die on the way, she had disagreed. "He believes his father's at the other end waiting. Highly unlikely, of course, but there's a sort of fierce resolution about the boy, about all of them, which saves them from despair, and it's better than any medicine we can give him. Dope and drugs can't equal that. We must let them go." Ruth looked at her brother, bunched up against the side of the truck, who was staring out to the fields as they swept by. It was over 2.5 years since she had last seen him. He was 16 now, but did not look 2.5 years older. So different from the Edith she remembered. His cheeks were pinched and hollow, his eyes as unnaturally bright as Jan's had once been, and he kept coughing. He looked as if he could go on lying there forever, without stirring. Yet at the Roth camp they had described him as a wild. She looked at Jan. She was surprised how helpful and good-tempered he had been since Jimpy's death in the scrum by the field kitchen. He had kept his sorrow to himself, and not once referred to Jimpy. Ruth could see that he was not entirely at ease with Edith yet. Did he resent his presence? There might be trouble here, for Edith must, to some extent, usurp the position that Jan had held, and Jan had a jealous nature. She looked at Bronia. The child was asleep. Her head in Ruth's lap, a smile on her face. Was she dreaming about the fairy story that Ruth had been telling her? The one about the princess and the brazen mountains? Perhaps in her dream Bronia was the princess, flying through the sky on her grey-blue wings. Then the prince, who had searched for 7 long years, would be flying beside her, leading her to his mountain kingdom, where they would live happily ever after. Fairy tales always ended like that, and Ruth was happy to think that Bronia was still young enough to believe that it was the same in real life. Ruth sighed. She leaned back, her head against the side of the truck, and dozed. And the train, with its long stream of trucks and carriages, all crammed to bursting point with refugees rattled and jolted towards Berlin. In the evening the train stopped and was shunted into the siding. Everyone got out to stretch his legs, but no one went too far away in case it started again. As the night came on and it grew colder, they drifted back to their carriages and trucks. Coal dust was scraped from the floorboards and the wood collected from outside, and the fire in Ruth's truck kindled. The refugees crowded around, stretching out their hands to the warmth. It was the hour of the singer and the storyteller. While they all shared what little food they had, a young man sang and his wife accompanied him on the guitar. He sang of the storks that fly back to Egypt, from Egypt to Poland's countryside, and of the villages that welcome them by placing cartwheels in the treetops and chimney stacks for the storks to build their nests on. A printer from Krakow told the tale of Karkos, the son who killed the dragon, and of Karkos' daughter who refused to marry a German prince. Others, laughing and making light of their experiences, told of miraculous escapes from the Nazis. "I had a free ride on the roof of a Nazi lorry," said one. "It was 80 miles before I was seen. A sniper spotted me from the top of a railway bridge, but he couldn't shoot straight, and I slid off into the bushes. The driver was so unnerved at the shooting that he drove slap into the bridge, and that was the end of him." Another told of a long journey on the roof of a train. "I can beat your yarn," said Eric. Everyone turned around to look at the boy slumped down the back of the truck. It was the first time he had spoken. "I'll tell you if you give me a peep at the fire," he said, "and my sisters too. And Jan, we're freezing out here." Ungrudgingly they made way for the family, the only children in the truck, to squeeze through to the stove. Ruth carried Bronia, who did not wake, and she snuggled down beside it. Jan sat on the other side with his chin on his knees and his arms clasping them. Edith stood up with his back to the side of the truck. When someone opened the stove to throw in a log, a shower of sparks leaped up, and for a few moments the flames lit up his pale features. "I was caught smuggling cheese into Warsaw, and they sent me back to Germany to slave on the land," he said. "The farm was near Guben, and the slaves came from all parts of Europe, mostly women and boys of my age. In the winter we cut peat to manure the soil. We were at it all day from dawn till dark. In spring we did the sowing, cabbage crop mostly. At harvest time we picked the plump white cabbage heads in crates and sent them into town. We lived on the outer leaves. They tasted bitter. I tried to run away, but they always fetched me back. Last winter, when the war turned against the Nazis and the muddles began, I succeeded. I hid under a train, under a cattle wagon, and lay on top of the axle with my arms and legs stretched out." "When this train started, you fell off," said Jan. "Afterwards, I sometimes wish I had," said Edith. "That is, until I found Ruth and Brony here again. Somehow I managed to cling on, and I got a free ride back to Poland." Jan laughed scornfully. "Why don't you travel that way here? It would leave the rest of us more room." "I'd never do that again," said Edith. "No," said Jan, and he looked with contempt at Edith's thin arms and bony wrists. "You're making it all up. There's no room to lie under the truck, nothing to hold on to." Edith seized him by the ear and pulled him to his feet. "Have you ever looked under a truck?" he said, and he described the underneath in such convincing detail that no one but Jan had questioned his accuracy. The boys were coming to blows when a printer pulled Jan to the floor, and there were cries of, "Let him get on with the story!" "You would have been shaken off," Jan shouted above the din, "like a rotten plum." "That's what anyone would expect," Edith shouted back. "But if you shut up and listen, I'll tell you why I wasn't." "When the noise had died down," he went on, "lying on my stomach, I found the view rather monotonous. It made me dizzy too. I had to shut my eyes, and the bumping carried with it. The boards of this truck are like a feather bed. The train ran through a puddle. More than a puddle, it must have been a flood, for I was splashed and soaked right through. But the water saved me. After that, I couldn't let go, even if I wanted to. Why not? Said Jan, impressed. The water froze on me. It made an icicle of me. When at last the train drew into the station, I was encased in ice from head to foot. I could hear Polish voices on the platform. I knew we must have crossed the frontier. My voice was the only part of me that wasn't frozen, so I shouted. The station master came and chopped me down with an axe. He wrapped me in blankets and carried me to the boiler house to thaw out. Took me 2 hours to thaw out. You don't look properly thawed out yet, said the printer, and threw him a crust of bread. Other voices joined in. Give him a blanket. A tall story, but he's earned a bed by the stove. Another story, someone. One to make us forget. Put some romance into it. The stories petered out after a while, when all was quiet and the refugees, packed like sardines on the floor of the truck, lay sleeping under the cold stars. Ruth whispered to Eric, Was it really true? Yes, it was true, said Eric. Nothing like that must ever happen to you again, said Ruth. He reached for his hand. She reached for his hand. It was cold, although he was close to the stove, and she clasped it tight, as if she never meant to let it go again. Okay, just 4 questions for us today. Try to put a bit of effort into them. Nice full sentence answers with evidence from the story to back up your ideas. Our creative activity today is a Y diagram. You don't have to do it in the form of a Y chart. You can produce this bit of work however you like. But it's about putting yourself in Eric's shoes and what do you think it looked like, sounded like, and felt like as he was on or under the train on his way to escape the Germans back to Poland. I really look forward to seeing what you've done. Don't forget, if you want to read another book, that's fine. I saw some rivet reading today from Johan, so that's great as well. But make sure you do a follow-up activity out of our home reading study after you've done some reading and send it through to me. Check out our blog today. We've got heaps of work on the blog, so have a good look at that. And I look forward to seeing Chapter 13 work from the Frozen Journey.